Okay, so first we'll go for Casper, and then if you want to use the raise hand function, it's in the, I think it's in the reactions. So in your Zoom, if there's a reactions, there's something called raise hand.
I think raise hand is the same as clap. That's what
No,
you mean,
it's the
right?
different icon. It's a different
I think you have
icon,
to
but it's in
open
the
the
same menu.
participants tab, right click on your name, and
I
then
mean,
it should let you do it.
we can also just accept the clap as a raise hand.
Yeah,
I mean,
clap
yeah,
also
that's
we don't
fine
have to be
too.
slaves to Zoom.
Okay, yeah, so Casper, you had a question?
Well, first, I wanted to say that I think this is amazing. The second thing I wanted to say is that it only solves, like it tackles one part of the problem and already makes a massive difference, but it doesn't tackle one other part of the problem. So what I want to say is that what you do is essentially adjust for general scale use, but there might also be shifts in scale use that are specific to the life satisfaction scale, right? So the idea that, you know, when you have a high income, then you might imagine even greater lives than you could if you had a lower income, right? And so I wonder whether this general idea of adjusting with these lots of calibration questions could get at the second sort of issue, while you're only looking at the sort of general response style issue. And then the second question you didn't show now with the methods, the detailed methods, but it seems to me that the most simple-minded version of doing this is to simply place all the responses to these calibration questions into whatever regression method you're using onto the right-hand side, and then you already get the adjusted scale. Or is that too simple-minded?
Okay, so those are great questions. I'll give my shot at answering both of them, but I want to highlight that since my co-authors, some of my co-authors are on the call, that they should feel free also to jump in and answer any questions that they want to tackle. So your first question was about the specific scale use that might be specific to a question like life satisfaction, and we absolutely agree. We think that that is likely to also be important. The approach that we develop is can also be applied to adjusting for specific scale use. You can't use the calibration questions that we use. They need to be specific to that question. So you'd essentially need to go back to something like the vignette, the vignettes from the vignette literature that are asking about different people's situations and then rate their life satisfaction. And then you could apply them in the same way. You could apply the method in exactly the same way. Now, as I mentioned, there are some objections, I think, to doing that with life satisfaction. So we would actually advocate a different approach, which is this kind of doing the scale use adjustment for the specific questions about aspects of well-being and then aggregating up. But if you were wedded to wanting to use life satisfaction as the answer to a question, you could do it as long as you substitute in for our darkness of circle questions, vignettes that are about life satisfaction. Your other question was about, once we have these calibration question responses, what about just including them as right-hand side variables in the regression? Won't that adjust for differences in scale use? And the answer is it won't, won't do as good a job as what we're proposing, which I didn't really have time to show you what we're doing. But the problems with just including those right-hand side variables, I think there are two problems. One is it's only going to adjust for the levels of people's answers and not the standard deviation differences across people. And I didn't, I showed you a little bit about how that matters, but we think it actually matters quite a bit in some applications. So, and the other problem is that there's going to be some measurement error in the responses to the calibration questions. And so including controls with measurement error isn't a complete control. So in our approach, we effectively model the measurement error and account for it.
Thank you.
Great. So next is Michael. You had a question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I thank you very much for doing this. I suppose I'm still trying to get my head around just what the assumptions are at the very start. So it's the idea that people might have different kind of ways in which they rank best to worst sets of scale. So we can work out by using something else how they do that, and then we can apply that onto how they rank their subjective well-being. Is that the idea?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So we see how they use the scale when rating the darkness of a circle, and there are systematic differences across people, and then we use those systematic differences to adjust for the differences, to adjust for the responses to questions like life satisfaction.
No further questions.
Okay, so Carolyn had a question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
It was a very interesting presentation, and I'd like you to explain a little more a couple of your slides. I'm not familiar with your method, so to understand fully what you're talking about, can you explain when you showed the calibrations, the comparison of one rating versus another, and you said people were using parts of the scale differently? Just walk through that a little more slowly. And then also to show us the equations that you were going to show us that you got, that you didn't do because you ran out of time, because that would probably help explain it further too.
Sure. So on the slides that you didn't follow, you mean the kind of scatter plots I was showing, like higher income versus lower income people?
Yes.
Using that?
That would,
Okay.
if you just walk through that a little more slowly or fully, something that, because I missed a logical step there. I was trying to understand how you
Sure.
could say you were using one part of the scale less.
Sure. Let me share this slide again.
Yeah.
So here's one of them. This is employed people x-axis and not employed people on the y-axis. And each of the points here is one of the 18 calibration questions we asked. So like 3 of them are about darkness of circles, for example, with different a low, medium, and a high. And them showing 95% confidence intervals on both sides. That's what these brackets are. And the red line here is the line to these 18 points. And then this black line is the identity. So if employed people and unemployed and not employed people were using the scale the same way, then we'd expect that on average, the mean response to this calibration question, if employed people are giving it a mean response of 42, then not employed people would also give a mean response of 42. So this point would lie on the identity line or close to it. And in general, these points would cluster around the identity line. Instead, what we're seeing is that for this calibration question, when employed people are giving an average answer of 42, not employed people are giving an average answer of like 25. So there's a difference, and in general, there's a downward shift when you go from the answers given by not employed, when you go from the answers given by employed people to not employed people. So not employed people are giving lower answers. That is this regression line, and all of these points pretty much lie below the identity line. And also, the not employed people are using more of the scale. They're going from a low of about 25 to a high of about 70, whereas employed people are going from a low of 42 to about 70 or 75. So that means that there's in our terminology, there's both a shifter difference between the groups, where the not employed have a negative shift relative to the employed. They're giving lower answers, and there's a kind of stretcher difference, that the not employed are using more of the scale. So I mean, let me know if you.
Helpful. Thank you.
Can I make one comment about that?
And just one other question. Have you published this so it's something I could read more about?
No, we haven't. We don't even have a written draft yet.
Oh, okay.
This is work in progress. I'm
Really
sorry.
interesting work. It's
Yeah,
really,
thank you. Happy to share the slides though.
that'd be helpful.
Sorry, Miles,
Great.
you were gonna.
Oh,
jump in
I
and
was
say
just
something?
going to say, there is going to be a general tendency for things that people have read about in the literature to go away, because if you have these scale use differences, if they're basically uncorrelated with true differences between demographic groups, then a certain amount of the things that are in people's heads as standard results in the literature are going to be there because of systematic scale use tendencies. So it's not, it's if your model is some of these scale use tendencies are just hard to predict a priori across demographic groups, then you'd expect for things that are in your head as standard results in the literature for some fraction of those to go away.
So just coming back to the other question on the equations that I skipped, what this is showing, what I'm trying to do here is be precise about what we mean by general scale use versus specific scale use. So this is the theory that this is the equation that basically just comes out directly from our assumption that there's a linear relationship between different people's responses. So W here is the mean response in the sample. And this is just saying that any given individual I's answer to question J is some linear function of the mean. From that, and so then this is the specific shifter parameter, question specific stretcher parameter that you could map onto those figures I was just showing you in terms of whether it's how displaced it is from the identity and how tilted it is. And then we can just do a little bit of algebra where we add and subtract a kind of general shifter and a general stretcher, and then rewrite the equation in terms of the sum of two pieces. We haven't changed anything other than this adding and subtracting. And now this part over here is what we call general scale use, because now this shifter and stretcher don't depend on the question. This is what applies across all questions. And this part is the question specific scale use of the way that any specific question you might have a different shifter or stretcher parameter than you have in general when you answer survey questions. And so in principle, in the model, different parts of these different kinds of parameters can be identified with different kinds of calibration questions like we talked about earlier.
Great. So the next person is Alberto.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. That's very interesting. And as Caroline, I'm looking forward to read the paper. I think that the association with psychophysical law is very intuitive, but it made me think that if you apply this same framework to assess variations, and that is to say, if you apply the Weber-Fechner law, then variations which are perceived as linear are actually logarithmic. That is to say, what people would report on the scale would be the logarithm of the actual underlying variations. Does it make sense?
Yes.
And I was thinking, so this would mean, for instance, that the linear association between satisfaction and income and the logarithm of income would be a linear association between latent satisfaction and income. Is it correct as well?
Yeah, that's very much the way we think about it. So we definitely come from that perspective, although you ought to be a little bit agnostic about that. There's many of these things we don't really know, but that would be kind of our starting place.
Okay. I was just thinking how, I mean, I found it very intuitive, but the implications in terms of assessment of variations, I find them pretty strong. Yeah, I just wanted to see what you think about it.
I mean, one thing I could say is that our assumption that there's a linear translation function between individuals implies that everyone's reporting function is the same up to an affine, positive affine transformation. So if you were concerned about trying to ultimately map things back to some cardinal level that you think is concave or something, I mean, I don't know, that would have to come from some philosophical theory because we don't observe that. But if that's what you believed, you could do the analysis with our approach with linear units. And then, since everybody has to share the same, essentially the same reporting function, you could then take the results of your regression or whatever of analysis and at the end map it back. But different people could map it back in different ways depending on what they want to assume about that relationship.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay. So next is Nick.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, Dan, and kudos to you guys for a really nice paper. I guess my question is more practical, and that is, how feasible do you think it is to start, having these calibration questions in a large-scale survey, and whether you have any future plans to, let's say, collecting longitudinal data as well?
Yeah, we've thought a lot about that. But basically, we assume we would like governments to collect them, like when in the British collection of data, and we assume governments will only be willing to collect 2 calibration questions. Things aren't identified if you do less than 2 calibration questions because you have 2 parameters, a stretcher and a shifter, the alpha and the beta. But we would strongly advocate that when data collection are done on subjective well-being, that you get 2 calibration questions. Everything can be done with the linearity assumption. You can do everything with just 2 calibration questions.
I mean, that would be great, Mike. And I think, I don't know if you are aware that the Understanding Society have this innovation panel where they always have each year ask the academic community on which questions you would like to include as experiment. So I think this would be a good opportunity to do that here, and you would get a huge sample. I think probably 10,000 observations.
That's a great idea. Thank you, Nick.
It's a good paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so next is Rito.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Really interesting, and it would be amazing if this would be the solution to the mystery of the U-shaped relationship between age and well-being. And I really wonder whether it is. So 2 points. You focused on cross-sectional data, and I assume that with panel data, the whole thing is a bit less of a concern because we can control for a mean level in the response of life satisfaction. And I wonder what your thoughts about applications with panel data is. So whether it is a trait or something that changes over time within an individual. And the other thing is the risk of adjusting too much, because it might well be the case that if I'm in a happy state, that I'm also changing my calibration exercise. So if I'm happy, I might be more like cheerful and use more of the whole scale. So my standard deviation between my answers might increase. And I wonder whether you thought about such a concern as well.
So yes, I mean, on the panel data point, you're right that if you have panel data and you effectively just focus on changes in life satisfaction, you're differencing out the shifter across people. But it turns out the shifter is actually easy to deal with. I mean, that's the easier part of the problem. The harder part is the stretcher parameter, and so that's actually a lot of the work that we're doing in terms of the developing the econometric method of the adjustment is to deal with the stretcher difference, and that would not be handled with fixed effects in panel data. And that's actually related to your other point about using the more of the scale. And I may not fully be understanding your question, but if I think what you were saying was that if you're in a cheerful mood, you maybe use more of the scale in responding to the happiness question. Is that what you had in mind?
No, to the calibration. Well, the problem would be if my satisfaction influences my answers in the calibration. So if there is some information content from the calibration to the happiness, and then we would control too much with your adjustment.
Well, that's very interesting. So that's not something that I've thought about, and it may be that that's an identifying assumption that we're making, that you're not getting an effect of.
I mean, you could set up an easy experiment with some mood treatment, and psychology knows a lot about that and has some examples, and see whether it has a systematic impact on the calibration. So you would need to show me that there's no systematic impact from mood to the calibration.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
And the time differencing, I worry about the assumption that the specific scale use is the same over time. So the idea that your fixed effect goes away requires that the way you're using the scale doesn't change between 2 points of time. And especially when you get into the specific scale use, you would worry about that. You would worry that the truth going higher would make you use the scale for life satisfaction differently. So if you have the specific calibration questions, which in our later data collection we will, and you had them over time, you could look at that.
Absolutely.
Great. So I think the next is Casper again.
I think Alois was in front of me, and there are several questions also in the chat that are pretty cool.
Yeah, so we'll go with Alois, and then I think Anna had a question in the chat that I can ask, and then there's
Katja, I think too.
Yeah, and then Katja.
So I was thinking along the same line as Reto does. So I was assuming that you assume that the shift into stretcher are not affected by a person's subjective well-being. And so I know now that this is the case, and I wonder to what extent you could test that. When I think it would be necessary to have a theory how life satisfaction affects the response behavior in the calibration questions. And maybe, I mean, if it's a theory about how you see the world, how bright or you dark you see the world, that you might come up with a test question that asks about brightness and darkness. So if it shades the world in a direction, and if you happen to have questions that all go in the same direction, in whether these circles are darker or brighter, I don't know. That then you cannot address it, but you might find this systematic effect if it's different for something that a phenomenon that is strengthened when people are cheerful, in a cheerful mood. But of course, I mean, it would be better to start with some theory how people answer these calibration questions. But no, this was very inspiring. Thanks a lot, the two of you.
Thank you, Alois. Yeah, so that's another great suggestion. I mean, just one quick thought is, I'm not too worried about a kind of effect that goes from life satisfaction to a specific question, like one specific question, like the brightness of the circle, because we also have the curviness of the line and the shape of a country, and or the area of land, and you know, so it's not going to depend too much on any one question. But your broader point, I completely agree.
Okay, great. So next is Katja.
Yeah, I also wanted to follow up on Reto Vanelli's question. And I thought that maybe if you, so the graphs you showed us with employed and unemployed people, if you could do the same graphs with people who reported low level life satisfaction versus high level life satisfaction, and you see that their questions and calibration are systematically different, maybe that's going to be, so if you see that there is no, then basically there is, nobody can have an argument that it's because of their latent life satisfaction that they calibrate that way. And also kind of stepping back, I wanted to ask, do you have some intuition of why, say, employed and unemployed people would use scales in different ways, apart from the kind of channel of well-being or that type of channel? Because it's easy to imagine why unemployed are less happy than employed, but why they see circles more dark and areas more large. What is the intuition there?
So my intuition is that they're different. There are different types of people on average, and they come from different family backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, and there are cultural influences on the way we use scales.
Okay, so you know, control for other individual characteristics there. So if you say instead of one employed and unemployment, do a full-on regression with gender, age, and other stuff, there would be no systematic differences in scale.
We were doing that. That's the regression we were doing. We had a lot of things in the regression besides employed, unemployed, and it still made a difference.
So I could show you that slide again if it would be.
Yeah, I was just fascinated by the difference between employed and unemployed. I was wondering, how did that happen, that they see circles in different ways?
Yeah, so here's the multivariate regression of the mean and the standard deviation on, you know, these separate regressions of the mean and the standard deviation on demographics.
No, one of the limitations of what we're trying to do is we're pretty much taking these two regressions as brute facts. And we're not trying in this paper to get deeply into why different groups would use it differently. These are just the facts of how people use them differently. And we would love to have other teams delve into why this is so, because we've got our hands full just dealing with the technical issues of the stretcher, for example, as Dan was talking about. So we would love other people to ask this question of why.
I see. Thank you. Yeah, because here it also shows that unemployment is significantly different. So yeah, I guess this is, if it is not via the channel of life satisfaction, then it doesn't really matter why. The concern might be if it is somehow related to life satisfaction, and then it can threaten the further estimates, right?
Yeah, your idea was great, Katja. I really like that, of looking at the split by the life satisfaction and the several related comments about testing for the effect of well-being on this calibration answers. Those are wonderful suggestions.
Great. So there was a question in the chat by Anna. So Anna, would you like to ask that question, or do you want me to read out what you have in the chat?
Hi, everyone. My apologies. I'm not tuning in properly. I'm homeschooling and it gets ugly, as you can imagine. So I'll just let you read my question, or maybe if someone else wants to tune in.
Yeah, sure. So Anna's question was about the different kinds of scale biases, so general and specific to life satisfaction. So she asked, can you comment on the psychological interpretation of the general scale use? Like, is the idea that people have a stable disposition to approach scales in a particular way? And then her second question was about the possibility of change as people get used to taking tests. So do you think there is learning?
So I think that these questions are questions that been, you know, there's been work in the response style literature in psychology, and I think that at least the work that I've seen and is treats them as largely stable dispositions. I mean, I think there's the current view in personality psychology is that there's nothing which is perfectly stable. You know, all these things can be affected by life experiences to at least to some extent, but you know, there is some stability, a lot of stability over time. You know, the other part of the question, I guess, is related to what we were just talking about the reasons why there are, you know, the reasons why there are scale use differences. And you know, as Miles said, we're taking it as given. I think of it as cultural differences. There's a very interesting paper you probably are aware of. I'm blanking on the name of the author, but it's an economist who looked at differences across countries in life satisfaction responses, and finding that they're correlated with average grades in schools, in the amount of grade inflation in different countries. And so I think that's, you know, that's kind of how I think of these general scale use, like different, you know, in different societies, there are different ways of using scales and that we're used to from other contexts. And we import those ways of using the scales from other contexts when we answer questions about life satisfaction. And it's not just true across countries, but within little, you know, sub-communities within a country, presumably as well.
We're going to know, we haven't fully analyzed all these aspects of the data, but we get people's calibration question answers 2 weeks apart. So we can see how people change over 2 weeks. I don't think that's very good for looking at systematic things, but you can certainly see how just in terms of a day shock to how you use the scale, that we can know about.
Okay, great. So the last question we have is by Casper.
Thanks. I realize we're slightly over time, but I think it's so cool, this paper, that it's fine. Yeah, two things. So just quickly on the on this linearity assumption and how much depends on it, because it seems to me that, you know, with 1 point or with one question you can get the shifter, with 2 questions you can get the shifter and this spreading thing, and with a third one you can get something slightly nonlinear, like a secondary polynomial, and so on. So it seems like when you have 18 questions, you can have a strongly nonlinear function, or is there something that I overlook?
No, absolutely. It's just it's all identified. Even if you have quite a bit of curvature, it's just a matter of how difficult the analysis is. This is, I want to sing the praises of our co-author John Anjou. This is really quite heroic technically to do what we've done so far, and it would be even more heroic to do it with the curvature. It's absolutely identified. It's in principle doable, but what we've done already is really quite heroic.
But I would say there's something else besides the technical part of it, which is that philosophically, like, you know, having the linearity assumption gives you a justification for using the mean response, or the mean excuse me, the mean response as the units of analysis, because it wouldn't matter whose you used. But once you add in quadratic or higher terms, then it would matter whose scale you used for the analysis. So I actually think it is, you know, and empirically we're finding that the deviations from linearity aren't very strong. So I think there's a compelling reason to want to stick with linearity.
Yeah, and I should say Ori and I have a standing bet about a different kind of linearity. So, and that is, if you change the labels on the scale in a way where logically there should be a nonlinear transformation, will people still do a linear transformation? So I'm on the side of betting that actually there is kind of a natural way that people answer up to an affine transformation, even if you put labels on the scale that should give them logically a curved trend. So there's translation functions between people, but there's also translation functions between different labelings of the scale. And so that if people resist nonlinear transformations for different labelings of the scale, then that would be evidence that there's kind of an underlying natural way of reporting. And you don't want to overinterpret what that means philosophically, but still an underlying natural way of reporting up to an affine transformation, regardless of labelings on the scale. If it's kind of a 100-point scale, that would be very interesting. That's one of the things on our back burner that we'd like to look at.
Then just one very quick final one, just adding to Reto's point. Would it make sense to just try and incentivize people to guess what other people have said about these calibration questions, to get at another way of trying to get around this issue of happiness influencing how you answer to the calibration questions? Or is this, maybe that's a bad idea, but just throwing it out there.
I guess that would let you test potentially whether people think that something like mood affects calibration questions. So we could learn about people's theories of that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you to Dan for presenting and for all of the audience for all of your questions.